Well, I like to think of myself as a kind of serial innovator and entrepreneur. I've kind of been in this for a couple decades now, close to it. I like to stay on top of new technology developments and kind of exploit them, I guess, consistently. One of the kind of early anchors for me was I was one of the very earliest professional journalists hired at Wired magazine in the early to mid 90s there, when we were kind of both announcing the digital revolution and explaining it to folks in the magazine, but also really inventing a lot of the early parts of the World Wide Web. We were doing one of the first, in fact, the first commercial website, and helped a lot in the early days there to figure that out. I went to a place called Global Business Network, which is kind of a futures-oriented think tank, is the way I used to think about it. Had a network of really remarkable people all over the world. We thought a lot about how to make things, how to think through major trends and developments and how they'd impact strategy 10, 20 years out. I left in kind of 2004, after the 2004 election, out of frustration with politics, to actually help basically the Democrats reinvent how to do politics around the new technologies of web video and social networking and mobile media and things like that, as I was kind of the founding director of a thing called the New Politics Institute, in which we were helping, again, the Democratic Party in general, but also ultimately kind of fed right into the Obama phenomena, which kind of overthrew the whole political establishment way of doing things. And then I've since then founded a company called Next Agenda. And Next Agenda was trying to figure out what's the next wave of technologies that would go beyond just how to change politics, but how to really start thinking about how do you really get massive innovation, civic innovation, on a broad scale. How do you get more remarkable people, more kind of high capacity people from outside Washington, outside traditional think tanks, to really start thinking deeply and longly about, and effectively about, how would you reinvent American society on all these levels? Because even though the Democrats or the progressive side of politics was winning, and at least at that time, it was not clear that we really understood the next agenda. Really what was the kind of thing that would reinvent America, reposition it for the next 10, 20, 50 years, this next century. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we seize on tools to actually leverage getting more and more brains like working on that problem. And we'll talk about that later. We did a lot with video and a lot with kind of collaboration tools. Social innovation, I think, is a growth industry, just both for the pressures of why it has to happen, but also the opportunity. And I think when I heard about what your project is, you say, okay, it's 15 years later. One of the things I would do for you guys is to really think about the technology inventory of, okay, what is really radically different then? And even think of it in a 5 or 10 year trajectory of, even if it isn't fully built out yet, like, what is the new system, technological system, that you can work with in a future innovation system? And I think it's quite profound what's happened here. And in talks I've been giving recently, I've been kind of really thinking deeply about this, because my career, as I mentioned, I've kind of watched the different stages of this digital revolution. Well, we've kind of hit the world that we started to envision really in that early 90s and mid 90s phase. I mean, when you look around the numbers now of, so just think about it. We finally dispersed. Now we've got about 75% of the planet now has cell phone connections. It's literally 75% of the planet now is connected, even through these creaky kind of bandwidth cell phones. But you can see once that bandwidth starts filling out, as we're watching in the developed countries, you've essentially got these big wireless connections now globally, which we've always anticipated. The power of these little iPhone 4 now, S or whatever, the latest one came out, is essentially the same power as an iPad 2. That iPad 2 is the same power as a supercomputer from the 1975 roughly era. And that in 75 it cost 31 million bucks. I've actually kind of done the research on this, and essentially that same, if you measure it by megaflops, speed of a computer chip, basically that is in what's every iPad 2 is, which is now shrunk into every iPhone, which is ultimately, with cost pressures, will basically get down in the hands of all 75% of those people on the planet around these high bandwidth connections. So now we've got extremely powerful tools connected with these high bandwidth things. Other thing which is really interesting is you've now got baked into all these tools, as a default, cameras. What's really interesting about all Apple products, they've got these little baked-in cameras to every phone, every iPad, even the iPods now have it, and all laptops as we know, and anyhow, it's all diffusing through the whole infrastructure. So what's interesting is now we have pretty high quality, they're really high definition cameras now, baked into all these things, connected to this thing that's high bandwidth now, or building out high bandwidth to do it. So you've got essentially a video infrastructure now that could connect anyone on the planet with a decent channel of video, open video channels, right? And you start thinking, wow, if you were starting not 50 years ago to think of innovation, but you said, what would happen in terms of innovation or social innovation or any kind of innovation if you could take anyone on the planet, connect it instantaneously through a decent video channel to actually connect subtly. Now, the thing about video, which is so amazing, it's worth stepping back at why is video so amazing. It's that the level of information that gets conveyed through video, here we are getting videoed here, is immensely more than you can get in a static photo for sure, but particularly from text. I mean, the amount of just the subtlety of a wink or of a bead of sweat or a smirk or a kind of pause when you ask me a question. If we were typing this back and forth in email, you'd have no idea about whether I was lying or whether I was fudging or whether I was nervous or I was anxious or whatever it is about it. So somehow the video is able to channel immense amounts of information, emotional information that you couldn't get, contextual information you couldn't get, subtleties, nuances, all this kind of stuff is actually happening. So again, think, it's gone from this thumbs written way of communicating to just fire hoses of information back and forth. The other thing about video, which is interesting, is it opens up in terms of learning huge swaths of what human beings do that you could never have communicated through typing. So how would you actually explain through typing how to break dance, or how to do a tango? Once that infrastructure is built, it basically is, and it's certainly on a trajectory to fill out in the next 5-10 years, for sure, inevitable, it's there. So you think, okay, that's there. And then what does that enable, that infrastructure? And how does that, in fact, impact innovation? And I just think you're watching essentially a potential tsunami of change that could come into this space. And I think it's something that's incredibly underestimated right now. Every day, YouTube sends off 2 billion videos. 2 billion videos. There's just one video set. I mean, the scale of this is immense. And so I think it's just something to really wrap your head around. What does that do for innovation? I would say there's something is going to happen there in a big way. There is something about concentration, focus, cross-fertilization, and physical proximity. Even though I was talking, about the possibilities of video, I'm also a huge believer that there's the magic of the physicality. So like when Jamie's out in New York, and I'm here, it's actually, we don't get a lot of innovation done. I mean, we get shit done, but we just think asynchronously in our own thing. But it's like when we spend hours and hours and hours and days and days and days and nights and nights and nights. And anyhow, we just spend a ton of time. And it's like, it's amazing how many things come out of that thing, and how amazing, how just in our little ideas, just as a little kind of microcosm of what happened, is, it's gone through like 4 major reinventions. We've thrown, literally 4 complete versions of this thing kind of out the window. It's morphed from civic to business to, all kinds of different markets we're trying to figure out. Anyhow, but it's interesting is as that process goes, and even down to get squeezed in this slide deck, there's just this kind of incredible, almost like, it's almost like a, nuclear fusion thing that you're just kind of squeezing it down. That it's in that there's something that about that also I think we should be thinking about for innovation is that focus, concentration, physicality, and just over and over and over again, twisting, turning, moving, looking, trying, sleeping on it, coming up. A bunch of stuff that goes with it too. So there's a kind of an interesting virtual possibilities, but also not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The next agenda frame I'm thinking about this is, it seems to be what we're entering into through these new technologies in a more general way, video being one of them, but the internet all across the board thing, is we're watching a step change in the numbers of people involved in innovation. And I think if you're gonna, so one of the ways to distill down what's happening now and in the next 10 years is to say, what will they think back, in 50 years time or something? What will they say what happened in, or even more, 100 years time? They'll say, well, okay, what happened in the early 21st century? And I think one of the things you're going to see some kind of basic stuff, which is worth just kind of reminding ourselves about. You're going to say, well, the world went global. That'll be one of the fundamental things that happened. So immediately, all these systems that have been organized one way is organized now globally. Now that's something to think about in terms of innovation. It's like, okay, that's interesting. So we've just been talking about cultural differences, which probably within 15 years will be much less pronounced. Jamie's mentioning how there's countercultures hitting all over. There's this melding and fusion and hybridization of cultures. Anyhow, so something big is happening in that space. I think the other thing that's happening is you're watching through the technologies like a step change, like a magnitude change of people who are going to be essentially brought into the game of innovation. In the basically, you're thinking about your space. Is if innovation in the 20th century was probably quantified as the upper 1% to 5% at most of your societies, I think in the 21st century it'll be like